Hello, and welcome to Chatty AF, the Anime Feminist podcast. My name is Vrai Kaiser. I'm a contributor and editor for Anime Feminist, and with me for this particular episode, I have three guests. Jacob, if you want to go first.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Jacob Chapman. I'm the assistant editor, associate editor at Anime News Network, and I'm a trans man, so if that, so if we're sort of mentioning our pronouns and stuff like that, which means I'm a dude, so, he, all that stuff. And, mostly I run editorial for Anime News Network. Any reviews or interviews or that sort of thing as you go up on site, I probably had my finger in it to some extent, doing copy editing or producing the piece or whatever it may have you. And, happy to be on this podcast.
Cool. Cayla, how about you?
Hi, I'm Cayla Coats. I run a YouTube channel called Keiko Cat, where I do anime, video game, and other stuff analysis. I am a trans, feminine, woman-ish, non-binary-ish, so she and they are my preferred pronouns. Check out my Twitter. There's a lot of really bad memes.
And Matt, how about you?
Hi, I'm Matt Thorn. I'm an associate professor in the faculty of manga at Kyoto Seika University, and I'm also a long-time translator of manga, and I'm also a trans woman who doesn't transition, which can be confusing for people, but my preferred pronouns are she and her. Thank you.
Wonderful. And I always forget to mention it, but I personally am non-binary and use they-them pronouns. These are all just great accomplished people who I'm happy to be talking to, but we especially wanted to gather together trans individuals to talk about our subject today, Wandering Sun, which was a manga that ran from 2002 to 2013, and an anime adaptation which aired in 2011 and had 12 episodes, although the television version actually edited two together and aired 11. The story involves a group of students as they go through grade school all the way up to high school graduation, and centers around Shuichi Nitori, who is described as a boy who wants to be a girl, so a trans girl, and Yoshino Takatsuki, described as a girl who wants to be a boy, and their friends and struggles of self-identification and awkward middle school feelings. It's a slice of life, basically. And I wanted to give a heads up that, as per usual with our series retrospect episodes, there will be spoilers, both for the anime and the manga. So, first of all, I wanted to start with all of you. What are your personal experiences with the manga? Matt, it might be most germane to let you go first, seeing as you were heavily involved in the translation effort.
Are you asking specifically about Wandering Sun or manga in general, or?
We should get to Wandering Sun eventually, but if you want to give us a little bit of an idea of how you got into translating, that would be cool.
Oh, wow, okay. I started translating in 1990 for what was then called Viz Comics. And I've been doing it ever since. I got into manga because of when I was, I think, 22, I read The Heart of Thomas by Hagiomoto, which you may know is about boys in love with boys, but that kind of blew my mind away, and I suppose changed my life. If I hadn't read that, I wouldn't be here. Literally, I would not be in this country probably, but so I've been translating manga for a long time, and particularly trying to get shoujo manga or girls and women's manga out to there into the English world. But I took a break from translating about 10 years because we were so busy with making our manga program at Seika. But now I'm back into it, and as you know, I was translating Wandering Sun for Fantagraphics, and unfortunately, as you know, sales were not so great, which is a topic in itself, but so we had to stop after volume 9.
Yeah, I know that you did an interview with Amelia, so I don't want to get too deep into the technicalities of things that you also discussed in that podcast, but I do want to come back to that.
Okay.
Definitely. Cayla, what about you, your personal experience with the manga or the anime or both?
Sure. I'd like to preface this by saying that I do own all 9 volumes of the localized manga. So
The expensive hardcover manga.
they're so beautiful.
The expensive, but gorgeous.
Yeah, and your translation is impeccable. So
Thank you.
I transitioned in 2011 when, I started my transition then. So right when the anime was airing. I've been a huge fan of anime and manga since I was in elementary school, actually. And this was the first time I had watched something where any sort of character that was transgressing gender boundaries wasn't relegated to, a position of villainy or used as a joke. And it's also one of the first times I had seen gender transgressing individuals who were treated realistically and didn't have some sort of, magical aspect tied to their gender transgression, i.e., Fisheye and those characters from Sailor Moon. So it was really sort of serendipitous that I watched the anime right as I had started taking HRT. And it was a very emotional few weeks for me as I was watching this. But Shuichi's sort of coming to terms with her identity was really, really sort of mirrored a lot of my experiences. So it was a pretty special thing. And after I finished watching the show, I went out and sought out the manga and read the entire thing.
Jacob, how about you?
So I have not read the manga, unfortunately, but I have seen the show, and
Sure.
but so my reaction to it, I believe I saw part of Wandering Sun, around the years that it came out, long before I had come out. I started transitioning in 2015. I remember there's a big gap between when I actually started transitioning and when I told people. So I think it was 2015 when I actually began. And lost my train of thought. Oh, right. So I'd seen the show many years before, and I hadn't really finished it. I think at the time I thought it was very interesting, but it was a little bit too slow paced for me, and I think I was more into things that had a little bit more punch to them and were less slice of life. So, but I came back to it. Afterwards, basically when I was going to interview the man that directed Wandering Sun, Ei Aoki, and so in preparation for that interview, I watched the whole show, and my reaction to it was, of course, a lot of familiarity, but there was also some alienation to it because of the cultural differences in how people perceived and treated their ideas of gender dysphoria in Japan, and also what they expected of it. I guess the biggest thing to me is that the way the anime concludes, which is very different from I assume the manga, is that they sort of come to full terms with their gender dysphoria and their identity, and then they sort of resolve to okay, but I'll have to grow up, quote unquote, normal to some extent. Like I'll have to accept that this dream is a dream and it's not unreal because of that, but I have to kind of put it up against the reality of reality, because they talk about transition in terms of like surgeries and expensive surgeries and stuff like that. And hormone treatment doesn't come up. The nuances of what we know about gender dysphoria now don't really come up, but it doesn't make any of the pre-stuff, any of the childhood feelings, like, any less relatable, and all that stuff was extremely, like, familiar and relatable, even though they don't spend a whole lot of time on the trans male character, so it wasn't necessarily, like, one-to-one with my experience, but, like, but the other stuff that I noticed throughout, not just with the two trans female characters, but also some of the other characters who kind of like either enjoy cross-dressing, or you even have this one guy who's like the closest thing to a villain in the show. There's not really one who was like sort of a future chaser, I guess you could say. Like
he's just kind of a dick.
He's kind of a dick, and he's characterized as somebody who is like sort of awakening to like specifically an attraction to trans women, which is certainly a thing. And basically a lot of nuance. There's a lot of different characters to talk about. It's not just like a character study on one or two people. So anyway, that's a long way of getting around to saying that I guess my reaction to it wasn't sort of the oh, this is me sort of a thing, because that wasn't because it wasn't me. It was so much it was just a familiarity with the many different types of people that the show was exploring, and the issues, and basically how Japan's attitudes toward that might differ toward how we would treat the story.
Yeah, it's definitely a story about somewhat frustratingly sometimes, I think, and you can chalk some of it up to, of course, cultural difference, and also the time when it was made. Because it did run for over a decade, and the anime aired 2 years before the manga actually finished. But also, there's a heavy emphasis on presentation is clothes that I think is interesting. And as far as, boy, do I want to come back to the trans-masculine characters thing, oh boy, do I want to come back to that. But personally speaking, I get what you're saying, I think, because this is very much a prestigious manga of, it's the trans one, it's the trans issues manga, and that can be, I think a lot of people who watch it do have at least points of, yes, that is me, but it can also be very intimidating in terms of, oh, is this just going to be a very special episode in long page format? So I kind of read it on a fluke at home visiting my local library. I picked up the first 3 volumes of the very nice translation, and sat in a reading room and promptly broke down crying in public, very unexpectedly. It's one of the things actually that frustrates me about the anime is so many of the things that I found very raw and touching about the manga are things that are alluded to or skimmed over entirely in the anime, which is unfortunate. Sadly,
I haven't actually even.
Please go on.
Oh, go ahead. Oh, I was just going to say I'm in the reverse position of Jacob, because I haven't seen the anime. I'm kind of surprised to hear how it's been described. I didn't realize it was that different from the
the anime solely covers the middle school portion, and of course it aired before a lot of the high school stuff was wrapped up, but it alludes to some of their grade school things but doesn't cover them, and only very occasionally has flashbacks. Even a lot of it is in dialogue.
Yeah, to elucidate the differences very directly, like it begins at the start of middle school. They kind of they mention maybe elementary school, but it is like, there's not even a full flashback. It's just maybe they'll mention something that happened in elementary school, and then it ends with the middle school play, the second one, where Shuichi plays the lead, the I Am a Girl play, and it ends like on that performance. He steps on a stage, or she steps on stage, and it ends. The curtain falls. So that's pretty much the entirety of the anime. So that's what I'm familiar with. So this should be interesting.
There's a lot of drama after that, and before that.
And honestly, I think there is a good conversation to be had in terms of not just what the anime chooses to cover, but what it chooses to leave out specifically. But first, I do want to touch a little bit on the fact you mentioned, or you alluded to, unfortunately, the manga is no longer being published in English because of low sales, and the hardcover editions are beautiful, but I am so often frustrated by that fact because this isn't a very long niche series that unfortunately has a very high price tag, and that often saddens me because it makes it hard or when it was available, it made it hard to recommend to people. So if you could shine some light on the process of publishing it and bringing it over and the decisions that were made, I'd love that.
The price point, pretty much with most of Fantagraphics books, they have really low print runs. They each volume will sell only a fairly small number, and in order to make any kind of profit, they have to have the price proportionally high per unit. I mean, this is just the way it works. In Japan, you've got massive publishers that can put out really cheap paperbacks because of the volume. They put out so many that they can have a really low price for each volume, for each copy. So that's what we are stuck with, and Fantagraphics tries to compensate with that with quality.
Mm-hmm.
We just try to make things really good, but of course, I mean, it's the irony is that trans people are famously poor. So
we're all extremely broke
because
I can attest to this.
Trans people are famously poor, so because the expenses of transitioning, the discrimination in workplace, on and on and on. So it's not anything that I can do anything about. I don't think there's anything that
no, absolutely
can really do
not.
about it.
I don't mean to imply
but,
that. It's just disappointing.
But it is just really a bitter irony that there's this work out there that is really not accessible, at least in our format, to a lot of trans people.
I actually had wondered if they had considered any kind of digital output, because that feels like a lot of manga distribution is heading that way.
I'm not sure. I'm sure there are economic reasons for this, but Fantagraphics is really reluctant to go digital, and I'm sure they have their reasons, but I haven't really heard their reasons in detail.
Mm-hmm.
But so. I mean, it seems like the obvious choice, but
yeah, because it would be great to have those last 6 volumes, which is, largely the stuff past what the anime covers, or even
right, and
because the anime covers,
and it's also, frankly,
go on, please.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say I was actually self-correcting. I think the anime covers through early volume 11, but please continue.
Oh, okay. I was just going to say that's it's after that. It's really late in the series, frankly, that Shimura starts to do some research.
Oh.
Because I'm sure. I mean, you probably felt this as you were reading it, but she was really basically winging it for more than half the series, and then finally, I think she starts to do some research, and she finally at the end puts in a really realistic trans character. Who isn't just a beautified pretty child and
that is definitely frustrating. That's one of the great cuts from the anime, is that they cut Yuki meeting Shuichi and Yoshino, whereas in the manga it's this horrific moment of, oh, the trans woman is a sexual predator, why have you done this in this otherwise very sweet trying to be good manga.
Oh, I am. Yeah. I wasn't talking about Yuki. Although, I mean, Yuki is realistic. I think Yuki is realistic. I was thinking of I forgot her name.
I know who you're talking about.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The married.
And she has a daughter, right?
Person.
Or a...
Right. I mean, that's a very real portrayal of a trans woman coming out late in life. And it's messy and it's not pretty. but that character I thought was important to introduce.
Absolutely.
Because
may I cut in for just a second?
Please do.
Please do. I haven't reread the manga in a while, but I do remember once we got to that character, the middle-aged trans woman, I remember having this sense that while she was pretty well-rounded, it felt almost like she was being used as this sort of narrative tool to make Shuichi a little bit scared of transition, right? Like, oh no, this is what I could become. I could become this sort of ridiculed, I don't want to say it because I don't believe it personally, but ugly person.
Right, but that's the reality, right? I mean, that's what a lot of us face and have to think about. So it's realistic, I think, to have Shuichi have to confront that sort of possibility, because for most people it's a big it's a it's not something you can just ignore. I mean, I suppose if you have like such supreme self-confidence that you really don't care at all what other people think, that would be, it wouldn't bother you. But
yeah, and it's to rope in the anime a little
anyway.
bit, just so we can all sort of throw in our 2 cents. That is, I think, one of the most effectively harrowing scenes is when Shuichi decides to come to school in her female presentation, and that is a gut-wrenching
Yeah.
moment.
Oh God, yeah.
Yes, yeah, that's that's, and then she's sort of traumatized for for 2 volumes, I think, after that. Yeah, as and that was I think realistic too. It was different from when Takatsuki-kun did it and that's simply the reality of different perceptions of a so-called girl in drag and a so-called boy in drag.
And I think that that's the first time that Shuichi has really come, because Shuichi's a child. It's the first time that she's really come to terms with that reality. Is when she shows up to school, and it's like, well, I don't understand. Takatsuki did this every day, and everybody thought it was cool. And Takatsuki,
Right.
has gender dysphoria, but the cool character Shimada, is that her name?
Chi-chan. Yes?
Yeah, Chi-chan.
Chi-chan, and she's she's very obviously very confident in her womanliness, but she's sort of what do you call it? She's sort of like the Takarazuka sort of extremely masculine presenting woman because she's either a lesbian or she's just very confident in her femininity and thinks it's cool to dress sort of like a boy occasionally. And
Right.
and both of these are totally okay. Everybody's like, oh, that's fine, and they don't really know that Takatsuki is struggling with these feelings of being male. But both of those are totally fine. But for Shuichi to come in a dress is considered unacceptable. And it's the first time that she's sort of encountering that bias
Right.
and isn't really sure what to do with it. It's sort of it's a little bit of a reality breaker for her.
Right.
Because I think Shuichi's, and I think this is the thing
Right.
that is reinforced at least in the anime a lot, is that Shuichi's personality is very she's very head in the clouds, and I think, and one of the reasons that the biggest thing
yeah,
that separates
yeah.
her from Takatsuki, the trans male character, is that Takatsuki only thinks of this stuff in terms of the physical realities of it. He's not like, oh, if I were a boy, I would be like this, like strong, cool, like handsome, like. He never thinks about it that way. He's just like, oh, I think this is what I am, and this is what I have to deal with, and I just think about the practical realities of it, which is I have to buy a binder, and I have to, I kind of have to think about my future at all times, and like I have to think about exactly when I can indulge this sort of proclivity of mine with a friend. Whereas Shuichi's not thinking about any of that. She's just thinking about like, oh well.
Right.
What if I was a princess, and like, what if everybody was the opposite of who they are, and all this stuff, and so she spent not enough time, I guess, thinking about the realities of it. So it's especially hard for her when she comes to school, and it's exactly like, okay, well, what did you think would happen? And Takatsuki is sort of prepared for that, and
Right.
she's not.
Right.
Yeah, which, honestly, I think
Right.
that
Right.
running theme of Takatsuki is pragmatic, Shuichi is a dreamer, winds up, there's a wonderful scene in the manga where it sort of contrasts the two of them, of Shuichi is dressing up in her sister's clothing and admiring the looks, and Takatsuki just kind of flops down on his bed and says, I wish I had a dick, and like it's this quiet fucking real moment, and I love it. But it also, like, spoilers for the manga, Takatsuki doesn't decide to transition or continue to present as male at the end of the manga, and the fact that he's coded as the pragmatic character really makes me angry.
Right. Well, I mean, we had to kind of come to terms with the fact, like, this is a story written by a cis woman, and it is also, I want to compare it sort of to, it's not the same, but similar to Transparent, also made by a cis woman, in that regardless of how accurate it does and doesn't get trans things, I think that one of the reasons it's sort of still enjoyable, because it doesn't necessarily get those things right or whatever, is because it's not actually necessarily 100% about the trans experience. It uses both Transparent and Wandering Sun use the trans character or the trans experience as like a center point for talking about a lot of different characters. In the case of Wandering Sun, it's about adolescent romance and youth and finding your identity in a broad sense, because it's like, so my least favorite character, Chiba, features in the story. Features in the story just as heavily, and her struggles just as a girl who feels unwanted are put, I think, basically on the same level as the trans character's struggles. And so it really brings home, like, oh, this is not necessarily... And in Transparent, for those who haven't seen it, like, Mora's late-stage transitioning is put on the same sort of level as the struggles of her narcissistic kids trying to find their place in the world. And I think that is a valid way of storytelling. It's just you kind of have to warn people. It's like, well... It isn't really fair to say that this is a story about the trans experience. The trans experience is part of it, but it's not. But they are both made by cis people, and they're more about like a group of people living in the same place in the same emotional circumstances at the same time, in both cases. And so it's like, Transparent is just as much about like. What's it like to be a really well-to-do Orthodox Jew in Southern California? Like that's a lot of what that story is about. And Wandering Sun is what is it like to be a middle school outcast in Japan? Like that's a lot of what's about. So.
Well, yes and no.
Right,
I definitely think that's forefront in the anime, but I also think there's a deliberate sanding off of issues there. A lot of what my trouble is with the anime is that it feels very much like it tried to forefront the middle school love quadrangles as much as possible,
right.
while shunting the trans issues that are more forefront in the manga into kind of window dressing until it can't anymore, which is why that scene with Shuichi coming to school in a skirt feels very powerful, where a lot of the anime doesn't. And there are other cuts as well, like ending with
I would disagree that the anime doesn't feel powerful. I would say that it does. I would just say that again, it is relying on you to relate to all of the emotional struggles these people are going through, and not just it's not just about the trans
oh yeah, no, certainly. I just, my point is more that the trans experience is it is not, the trans experience is still an elevated issue of central concern in the manga more so than the anime, which I think makes it more valid to say, well, you did some of this bad.
Right. I believe you.
But no, yeah, and I think, Cayla, I'd be interested in seeing where you stand with the two adaptations since you've seen them both.
Oh, sure. Well, this is with the caveat that, again, I haven't read the manga in, I guess it's been a few years. I've skimmed over a few chapters in preparation for this podcast, but I do certainly hold the manga closer to my heart than I do the anime. And I do think that, I mean... Of course, there's so much more space, but even so, I think in the same amount of, in one volume of the manga, I think there's quite a bit more nuance and subtlety in addressing these sorts of issues than there was in the anime. But I don't know, it's very difficult to sort of place one above the other, since the anime was my initial time seeing trans characters in an anime that aren't portrayed like hugely in a problematic way.
It's one of those things that I'm very glad this exists. I wish, it's one of the, when it is rare, this rare, you end up heaping all of the expectations on the one thing that exists, the one imperfect thing.
Right.
Yeah, I will say though that while it could have been, I guess, a bit more definite, the end of the manga did make me very happy in that it did seem to be implying that Shuichi was going to go forward with transition and not fall to the whims of society. And that that panel between her and Anna, where Shuichi says, Anna, I want to be a girl, and she simply responds, I guess that makes me a lesbian.
Oh, it's so good.
It's really just sort of touching and sweet, and gave me a much more concrete sense of finality, as in, yes, okay, this... I feel a little bit better about loving this series so much than the end of the anime, which was very sort of gray, I guess, and left room for people to interpret it as, oh, well, these two kids were going through a phase, or something terrible like that.
I don't know. I didn't get the impression from the anime that they were going through a phase. It was that it was just a sort of a Japanese ethos or Japanese thing of like this is real, like this is who they are, but they might have to give it up, and that's sad. It's a mono no aware. It's, oh no, this is temporary, and that's sad. But at the same time, I don't what's her Takatsuki wasn't really in the forefront, so they didn't really settle on what he wanted to do with his future. But for Shuichi, it pointed similar to what I'm hearing from the manga, in that it's like, well, I think maybe she's going to try to commit to this for life. What she had to put aside was the idea of being a perfect, beautiful girl. It's just like, oh, I think, because the way the anime ends, because I just now revisited for the podcast, is that she has to make a wish on a shooting star, and she's been wishing over and over for this whole thing, like, I want my voice to stop changing, I want to become a girl, and she stops wishing that for the first time. But the wish she replaces with is not like, oh, I don't care about that. It's, I want the play to go well, I want to be able to take care of myself, and all of that doesn't preclude, it doesn't like, oh, so I'm just going to throw this gender transition thing out of because the play that they're doing is a statement of purpose for her. She is coming out and saying, I am a girl, it's the name of the play. But it's not like, I think it's just an acknowledgement that this will be hard work, and that it's not, she has to face reality in all the potential ugliness of it. And I think that's that's valid as well. My point is that I didn't find the anime saying that this was vague or that this was a phase or anything like that. It was just saying, like, this isn't, it's not playtime. Basically, it's allowed to be playtime in the anime, which is very soft. There's not a lot of adversity. Like, they have this wonderful group of friends that's very supportive of them, which I liked. That it's not about bullying them for being trans or whatever with it, which is apparently happened more in elementary school, which is not explored by the anime. But that they had this wonderful supportive group of friends, and that it's like this, basically this safe garden where they're able to flourish, and that I think what the anime ends with is that this is temporary. Like, you can't expect the rest of the world to be like that, but it's nice to have it while it exists. But I don't think it was saying that it was a phase. I think it was saying that this lack of adversity to them being trans was a phase, but not that they are, was the impression that I got from the anime. And the impression that I got from the director when I interviewed him as well.
Gotcha.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I think I'm certainly bringing a very Western perspective to this, so I think it's quite possible that I misinterpreted some things.
Well, I think that there is room in the middle, because on the one hand, yes, the adversity, I think that's a valid reading, but also at the same time, there are things like, Chi-chan's friend pulls her away from Shuichi after Shuichi comes to school as a girl and says, nobody wants you to, you shouldn't be seen with this freak. And then in the manga, there's an additional scene where you find out that they fought about that, and that Chi-chan makes this dramatic statement that she, as cis girl, wants to stand by her trans friend. And, like, little grace notes like that, I think, are important as this sort of supportive thing when you're teaching to a certain extent, with a show about that includes this much representation, you are teaching the majority audience, and I feel to an extent that, especially if that stuff is in the source material, it's important to bring it over.
Right. Yeah. That's very true. I think once again this comes to a tone difference more. That I think that the intended tone of the original is just to explore. Is not to explore the trans experience, which you can see is definitely is a flaw. It's just to explore this, like, temporary point in middle school where, before the realities of life set in for everybody, and it's not just focused only on the trans characters, which is so. That's definitely a problem if you're trying to see this as a show that's intended to broaden people's understanding of transness. But I don't think it was ever trying to be that. So that can be definitely. You can see that as a flaw all on its own, or you can say, well, it did well for what it was trying to do, or whatever the case may be. But definitely, of the trans stories that have spoke to me most, like Wandering Sun is a very enjoyable story, but it actually didn't. The things that it spoke to me on weren't really on a transgender level. It was more like on a general emotional level. Stuff that spoke to me more as a trans man or just as a trans person. Has not really been Wandering Sun. It's been other types of story. I would say Revolutionary Girl Utena, actually, if you're talking solely about anime stuff, spoke to me more about a gender transgression experience solely than Wandering Sun did, but that's only speaking about the anime. I'm sure if I read the manga, I would feel very differently about it.
No one talks about the Utena manga. That's not a thing.
Well, no, and I meant the show. I'd never read I've read a little bit of it, but
Yeah, no, totally. Just sorry, Matt, you've been wanting to say something.
Yeah, that's all right. This gets back to what Vrai was saying about this being the only one out there, and so it has to be all things to all people, which it can't. So I'm actually curious to know how Western trans people reacted to this, because I know that in Japan there was on the one hand amongst trans people in Japan there was this feeling, oh great, we're finally being represented, but there's also all these problems with the way we're being represented, and also we're being represented by someone who's not one of us. So there was that ambivalence, and I'm wondering if part of the reason for the low sales is that it just simply didn't speak to a lot of trans people who may see the trans experiences as, for one thing, a very political thing, which few in Japan it hasn't quite gotten to that point yet. I mean, it might be getting there, but it's a big political debate in the U.S., for example, in a way that it's not in Japan. And so I think for a lot of people who are used to very nuanced, debates about trans issues, it might seem extraordinarily oversimplified.
Well, yes and no. I mean, it's certainly, politically speaking, a very large issue in the U.S., but trans depictions in fiction are still remarkably rare, so I think there is sort of a similar thing. I know a lot of particularly trans men, trans masculine people had a really hard time with the manga because they really liked Takatsuki and were disappointed that in America, I think the biggest difference is that this concept of gender fluidity, gender queerness being between things, that I don't think is a point so much in Japanese understanding. They were hoping that Takatsuki's character would at least go in that direction, and to have it sort of end on a note of, oh, but yeah, I am a girl though, which is valid. Some adolescents do grow up that way, but when that representation is so rare, it's disappointing to be told, you're gonna turn out cis though.
Right. Well, yeah, and I wouldn't even say that it's a Western gender fluidity thing, because as a binary trans person that's Western, like, to hear that the manga ends that way for Takatsuki is bullshit. So I would say
it's some super bullshit.
And so, but and that makes me happy that the anime ends where it does, so I never have to get to that point with him. But
Well, of course, gender fluidity is a thing in Japan, and maybe if this had been if she had started and ended this 2 years, later, it might have gone in a more nuanced direction, because a lot more gender fluid people are speaking up in Japan in a way that maybe they weren't at the time when she was doing this.
Yeah, I'd love if you have any more stories to tell about the responses of Japanese readers, particularly trans, and because that's something I think it's so rare, especially because of the language barrier for those of us in the West who want to know about the Japanese trans experience, but are just kind of, we don't know. Yeah.
Well, one thing is that, and this is still, I mean, in it seems that in America it's a settled issue that if someone is transitioned, that then when you refer to them before they transition, you still use the same, that the pronouns that they identify as now. Mm-hmm. So you don't say she used to be a boy. You don't. That's not done in the U.S. or it shouldn't be done in the U.S. But in Japan, it's still really common to hear trans people say that, like I used to be a boy or I used to be a girl. Or talking about becoming a boy, becoming a girl, and you see that a lot in this book. And in fact, the blurbs are all a boy who wants to be a girl and a girl who wants to be a boy, which is right there. It's problematic, but in Japan, this kind of thinking is still really common, and it's not seen as a big issue as far as I can tell, even in the trans community. Mm-hmm. Probably one reason is that we don't often use third-person pronouns, so it's possible to talk about people or write about people, pages and pages without once referring to their gender in the form of a pronoun. Mm-hmm. So maybe it's just not such a, I don't know, I don't know.
Well, it also used to be that way in the U.S. as well. Certainly during the early 90s, a lot of trans women would refer to themselves as... first of all, I'm going to say a dirty word here, but, the T word, I guess, I'm not going to say it out loud in case it bothers people, but that didn't used to be a dirty word. It used to be a word that both drag queens and trans women sort of wore with pride briefly, because it was seen as reclaiming a slur. But it's not... But that was also just in defiance of what was available to people, and so that it was more common for the people to say, oh well, I used to be a man, or I used to be a woman, and all that sort of thing, even within the gay community and within the trans community, because that's just kind of what was available to people. And I think that that's also
right.
When you can get the world to like respect you to such an extent that they are willing to take into account your past as an invalid thing for you emotionally, etc. Like that's a big step in awareness and respect and stuff like that. That I think that communities adapt with what is available to them, and I think that's a large part of it as well.
Yeah, there's definitely when I mentioned earlier that there's a lot in the anime in particular about performance means clothes, and it reminded me very much of the drag scene in the U.S. in the 70s and 80s, where there is identity is so ignored that the sort of showing of clothing is the most visible element that you have at hand. And I actually wondered if that is because that is something trans people in the US are still fighting against, is this idea that if you are trans, it means you transitioned. Otherwise, you're... Right. And I wondered where the Japanese trans community is with that.
Well, there's certainly this idea that if you're trans, then, well, obviously you're going to transition, you're going to do all of these medical procedures, which is something that, as a non-transitioning person, I face, a lot, both, I think, in America and in Japan, too. There's an expectation.
Sure. Which is bullshit, and I give my heartfelt sympathies to you. It really sucks.
It does. But it is what it is.
Yeah, sure. And you mentioned, that issue of before and after and sort of personal pronoun usage. So you wanted to talk about the issue of how you decided to translate pronouns and how people are referred to in the manga. How was that decision?
Yeah. Well, I talked about this the other day, but in Japanese, it's not so much the third person pronouns, but the first person pronouns, and also the honorifics, the gendered honorifics. Calling Takatsuki-kun. It was, I think, originally the kids intended it as a sort of a joke because Takatsuki-kun is so boyish, and what's interesting is that Nitori-kun does not ever once complain about being called Nitori-kun. But then again, as Jacob pointed out, Nitori-kun always has her head in the clouds, and it's really fun to see. I'm sorry, I'm going off track here, but it's really fun to see her grow as a person, because she grows really slowly, but she's actually really stubborn. She does not ever give in and say, okay, forget it, I'm not going to do this. This is just a nightmare, which I think a lot of trans people do. They like, it's better to be in the closet. There was a essay that was going around, I'm glad I didn't come out kind of essay going around a couple of years ago, but I think that's true for a lot of people. But Nitori-kun she's dippy, but she's also like persistent to the end. It's like, okay, I'm doing this, and she does it, in her own quiet way.
It's really interesting to see her as kind of a foil to Mako-chan, who is probably my favorite character. This oh God, I love her.
Mako-chan, who overthinks everything.
Yeah, it's just and yet at the same time has probably the most accepting coming out.
Realistic.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
And also just that issue of really hit close to home for me is that her whole thing is, I mean, it's kind of informed because the art style is so uniformly cute, but she worries about, I'm chubby, I wear glasses, I have freckles, I'm not cute, I can't pass well.
Right, I think that she's actually my favorite character in the whole thing.
Oh, she's very good.
Because she's I don't know. I think my favorite scene in the show, at least the most memorable one, is the one where she demands that Nitori, which again is just not thinking about the realities of this. It's just like, oh, well, I'm a girl. Wouldn't it be nice to think about being a princess? And she's like, no, your voice is going to change. Come here, like we're going to record our voices for posterity, and we have to do it in dresses. And she's like, why do we have to do it in dresses? And she's like, it's the principle of the thing, And she, it's a shame because I feel like if she had the if she had the looks that Nitori was blessed with, Shuichi, I have that right. Shuichi Nitori was blessed with, that she could go pretty far, but she's just so I guess undercut and so self conscious about how she looks and sounds, and it really isn't fair. But I think that's sort of the point, is that it's not particularly fair.
Yeah, and she's the one who also has like very pronounced feminine gestures. Like she talks with her hands a lot more than Shuichi does. It feels like she's studied what it is to be feminine because she feels like she has this extra roadblock in her way. My heart.
I think probably most trans people see more of themselves in Mako-chan than in Nitori, or even maybe Takatsuki.
Weirdly enough, I was going to say, that was my perception watching it, is I was like, I think probably a lot of trans women might relate more to, and that was just my impression, might relate more to her because she cares about it, and she can't stop thinking about it, and anybody who's aware who's kind of come out of the egg and aware they're trans, you think about it all the time if you can't have it
out
yet.
Of the egg.
And Nitori doesn't want to think about it, and weirdly, so I wanted to bring this up, of all the characters whose trans experience I related to most, it was actually Nitori who is I think, but not for the reasons that probably the author intended, because Nitori is sort of a fantasy. Nitori is sort of a fantasy in that in how pretty she is and how much she's how pure of a soul she is. It's a little bit of a and every girl is in love with her, and it makes sense that she's sort of a protagonist fantasy, but. However, but I related to her most in terms of transness because when I was a kid, that's how I felt. I didn't come to probably because I was so sheltered. I was sheltered from a lot of pop culture and a lot of things that I had no idea what trans people were until I was way too old to not have known. When I was 16 or 17, probably, I didn't even know what that was. So because it was in a very conservative upbringing. My perception of my transness was just well, of course I'm a boy. I don't understand why this is a problem for anybody. And but even then, when it was I was told, oh no, you're a girl and this sort of thing, I didn't rebel against it. I wasn't always thinking about it. I was just oh, okay. All right. But that doesn't mean that I have to act like one, I guess. But I wasn't always resenting it. I didn't think about it. I just hung out with boys and I just did sort of whatever I wanted and they let me do whatever I wanted. And I didn't think of my name as my name was almost sort of kind of gender neutral, and it wasn't a name that literally anybody else around me had, so I never thought about that. But I didn't start feeling actual gender dysphoria until puberty. And then I just became an angry, temperamental monster. But we never see Nitori get to that point. And I think that if we saw if Nitori was a real character, and I think if we saw her get to that point, which I know we did the manga, but in a real life setting, if that had happened, that's when Nitori would find anger that she didn't know she possessed, because it's oh no, this is real. I thought this was just all sort of I thought this was all just sort of dumb rules people made up for each other, because I didn't know anything about sex education or anything like that. I didn't know. So
Well, I'd like to know what the other people who read the manga think, because I think she did once she went to school in a dress and had that traumatic experience. I think from there she has a lot of anger, but she's so passive aggressive that she doesn't come straight out and say I'm angry or throw things. But she expresses it in really passive aggressive ways. And the fact that she's persistent to the end, she's she never says, fuck you, I'm going to do what I want. But she does it. That's what she does. What I'd like to know what Vrai and Cayla think.
Cayla, please go ahead.
Oh, sure. I completely agree with you, Matt. I certainly do remember there being just this. It seems like she has discomfort involving anger, like direct anger, at least. I think that directness in general is really difficult for Shu, but I do have this distinct feeling. I can't remember anything specifically, but I do remember noting that she was very sort of subversively angry and sort of like maybe even a little bit nasty sometimes.
Yeah.
It certainly makes her an interesting foil to Saorin, who I actually kind of have an incredible amount of sympathy for because I was that shitty middle schooler. I was absolutely that I'm not angry that I've been rejected, I just hate everything and I'm smarter than all of you.
Right.
Well, Saorin has a huge fan base. She has a huge fan base in Japan. I don't know about in the
that does not
world,
surprise me. Even
there are a lot of
like she's like, I don't know if you guys have read a silent or seen A Silent Voice, but
not yet, sadly.
I can't remember the character's name, but Saori is the equivalent of that character who is like the only one not going along with let's all be friends with the.
Oh, they have the same haircut as well, which is a little bit eerie.
It is 100% a thing that Japanese, and I think Japanese fans glom onto because it's basically assertive. It's extremely assertive, extreme femininity, I guess, which I think is why. But for me, I both characters, I'm almost allergic to passive aggression. I'm straight up allergic to passive aggression. So I hate those kinds of characters. But I understand why they have such big fan bases in Japan, because it's like, oh, she's like more feminine than I could ever be, but also like extremely assertive and gets what she wants. And even if she doesn't get what she wants, and both characters don't really get what they want, but
Sure. She also means so well, like in offering Nitori the dresses, and does not understand why this might be a deeply uncomfortable thing. Like, here, I'm giving you the thing you want. Why are you upset with me? Just, this shitty kid. Right.
It's true, and she's so cruel to Takatsuki, but it's sort of understandable. I definitely don't want to excuse it, but I mean, that's one thing I find really interesting about this series is just that I think, like Jacob touched on earlier, or Matt, I'm sorry, I forget who mentioned this, but there really isn't a villain. It's just a bunch of people who have a bunch of different perspectives who want different things.
Yeah.
As much as I've talked about this as a manga and anime about transness, it is also probably the most accurate to my middle school experience of an anime that I've ever watched. So it does succeed in that. Just awkward.
And even that boy who it's embarrassing because as the translator I should remember all these, but I've forgotten the name of the boy who is the closest thing to a villain, at least for the first
Doi.
For a big chunk of the series. What's his name?
Doi.
But his psychology is really complicated too. Doi, he has his own. Mm-hmm. He has his own stuff going on. Mm-hmm. Basically, he's in love with Nitori, with Shuichi, but he just doesn't know how to process it. So.
Yeah, it is kind of like Utena, where it's like, oh, some of you are very awful, but you still have time to grow out of this and become like actual compassionate, empathetic adults.
Yeah, I wanted to say, like, I definitely related to it. When I said I related to it more generally emotionally than on a trans level, I definitely meant that, like, oh, this is very true to middle school experience and how these kids kind of acted. Well, maybe they're a little more grown up than a lot of middle schoolers I remember, but like optimistically, this is how middle school kind of was and how people thought and stuff like that. So I related to that more and on that level more than I did the trans aspect, just because so little time is spent with Takatsuki and the inaccuracies that follow from Shimura writing it the way she did.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is
that's too bad. I have to watch the anime now, but.
It's very pretty.
It's too bad because Takatsuki is also a rich character. She has a lot of anger, and she expresses her anger a lot. But
it's Takatsuki's scenes as an elementary schooler were what I mourned losing more than anything, because those kind of very young inklings, I feel like even if the author was kind of stumbling around in the dark, she hits some real good points there.
Yeah, well, she has a knack for just conveying subtleties of human emotions and relationships, and that's to me that's really Shimura's thing, is she can express the most subtle sort of complicated feeling with just drawing, a single drawing, and her drawings aren't even that complicated.
I wouldn't be surprised if she's kind of taking a break now, that because Wandering Sun was such an enormous undertaking, but it has been 4 years now. Is she working on something else?
Yeah, she ended both of them quite abruptly. I think, is she working on something now? I think she is. I think she may have just recently started something. I could check it, but I don't.
It is interesting that
But I guess she.
Well, it is interesting to me that the director of the show, Aoki, like when I talk to him, like all the stuff that he does normally is, he did Fate Zero, and like right now he's doing Recreators and All Noah's Here and stuff like that, where it's just this big explosive action stuff. But like he was very adamant that the things that he like really really likes the most and wants to do are not even shoujo. It's just, he said, Takako Shimura's work, I want to adapt more of her work, and he said, I hope that she does more things. And what Wandering Sun sticks out in his filmography. It sticks out. It's like, wait, you did all this like Zack Snyder-esque. I use that word because that's what he says he makes. He's
sure.
Like, Zack Snyder-esque action fantasy, and then with the sort of cold color palette and the UFO table sort of production values, and it's like, but you want to make Shimura's manga? He said, yeah, Shimura's manga. Because the reason that he likes it so much, even though he's not like a lesbian or a trans person, is that he related to the way that people express themselves emotionally in that time of life in middle school. So that's why he loved it so much. And I asked him, like, I asked him this before he knew that I was trans, because I decided to just come out to this guy, because what have I got to lose? Because I was I passed at that point, it doesn't matter. So, but when I was talking to him, I said, well, did you do any research on trans people to do this story? Have you ever met somebody who's trans? He said no, and he said no because I wanted to just see it as these characters, as basically as they express themselves emotionally, and as that. He said, I didn't look into the realities of being trans, he said, because that's not really what the story was about, so I just decided to make it as true to these characters emotionally as they were written as possible. So I asked him, I said, well, so you've never met a trans person who's seen it and what their opinion was? He said, no. I said, well, now you have, and then I told him. But when I told him, I was wondering, and so I was wondering if he would be shocked, if it would bother him. Like, I have no idea what this guy's fucking political leanings are. So, sorry for the F-bomb. But,
fucking go for it.
But his reaction was extremely like flattered, and he was like, "Well, did you like it? Was it And I didn't go into detail, because and you're not going to go into detail telling the director what you did and didn't like a thing about a thing.
Mm-hmm.
I told him that it was good and it was emotionally validated. But he seemed very touched by that, and he didn't seem bothered that I was trans or anything like that. It was so that was a nice experience to get to have, was to like tell this guy, well, I didn't tell him it wasn't perfect, but like,
Sure.
This impact, this thing that you made has an impact on the real people whose lives it reflects, and so, that it was good and that I liked it.
It's definitely better.
I think what he
seemed
what
very
he said
interested
is legitimate.
Yeah. He seemed very interested in it being good from the perspective of a trans person, which that was all I needed, was like, oh, he cares about this and he's not like weirded out by it.
Right.
Yeah. He I assume he wasn't involved. He wasn't the director of Sweet Blue Flowers, was he? No, I don't. No.
He didn't get that one. He wanted to, apparently. So.
Oh, next time. But it's, where the hell is I going? It's certainly better that I am glad that it exists, rather than to have it not exist at all. I want it to be there imperfectly than non-existent.
Right. Well, let's hope that we get more and more representation out there, and preferably by people who
Yeah, I mean,
representing themselves.
One keeps hoping. Cayla, what were you going to say?
Oh, I was just going to say, going back to what the director said about wanting to convey the emotionality of the characters as accurately as possible, that did result in some really sort of stunning moments here and there in the show. I always especially like to note the end of the first episode when Maho walks in on Shuichi wearing her clothes and then sort of rips them off of her, and then Shuichi just has this gorgeously animated running scene through the town at night, and there are these sort of really well-timed cuts to different people sort of staring at her as she's running. And just in the middle of this anxiety attack, she comes across Yoshino, and just the emotionality of that scene is orchestrated so well. And I think there are moments like that where it's very valuable to have these scenes animated and with a soundtrack. Claire de Lune was an excellent choice to have there.
It is definitely an anime that can frame a scene well.
I look forward to seeing. I feel like there are more. I believe that right now there's a manga with a trans male. It's a basketball manga, and there's a trans male character in it. I don't remember the name of it, unfortunately.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I don't remember the name of it, but it is. It's an all-girls basketball team, and one of them is trans male, and they don't bury the lead on that. It's not waffly, like straight up. They just sort of say that, and so that's interesting. And I feel like the stuff has been burgeoning more. I've seen more LGBT representation in anime in the past 2 years than I've seen in the previous 8. So that's interesting.
Agreed.
Yeah.
And so that's interesting. So I feel like at the very least, artists are interested in these issues.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like it took them an entire TV series to get around to it, but I was really impressed with what the Tiger and Bunny crew did with Nathan in The Rising. Like that was a really excellent exploration of gender fluidity that was good. And yes, so this stuff is out there slowly.
Yeah, I've got to give a shout out to Rui Ninomiya from Gatchaman Crowds as well.
Yeah, so it's not hopeless, it's just slow. And, I feel like this anime and manga certainly deserve, every piece of representation is somebody's first, I guess, to bastardize a Stan Lee quote. But yeah, and we're getting on to about an hour now. But if you guys have any issues that we didn't cover that you'd like to bring up, please do.
I wonder if you're aware of. It hasn't been translated. I'd really like to translate it. A manga called Shimanami Tasogare, which is Tasogare means like a twilight. Shimanami is the name of an area, town. Shimanami Twilight, and it's by a non-binary artist named Kamatani Yuki, and the story has a lot of different characters, but it starts with a boy who is exposed as gay. He's a high school boy. He's exposed as gay when his friends find out that he's been looking at gay porn on his smartphone. And it starts with him getting ready to jump off of a building and kill himself. And this interesting woman comes along and basically sort of rescues him by making him curious about who she is. And she runs this strange little sort of gathering place, this where people who don't fit in all accumulate, and one of the characters introduced in the second volume is a apparently trans character, but again really young, like I think like 12 years old or something like that. A assigned at birth male who identifies as a girl, and this is probably the first time that I can think of where an actual trans person is talking about this or portraying this. The other cases I can think of are just like straight up sort of essay manga. Like I transitioned and here's how it went, and these essay manga tend to be, well, frankly, not so great as manga. Not well drawn, not terribly, but I mean they're interesting to read as essays, but as works of fiction, it's but so Shimanami Tasogari is something. It's only 2 volumes so far, but I'm really interested to see how the author goes.
Yeah, no, if you could get the rights to translate that,
see it in English.
I think a lot of people would be super interested in reading it. So I'll have my fingers crossed.
Yeah, because it for one thing, it's a much more realistic portrayal of the reality for a lot of LGBT, etc. folks in Japan right now. But it's really a hot time for LGBT issues in Japan. Just the last 6 years or so, it's just taken off. Awareness is really skyrocketed.
Yeah. You've got at least one prefecture of marriage equality now. That's
right. So it's become a big issue, and we're going to see more of these. So we won't have to spend the next 10 years going over the problems with Wandering Sun. So there will be more on the way.
Cayla, Jacob, did you have anything more you wanted to talk about?
No, I think I touched on pretty much everything that I was interested in saying, but I've had a really wonderful time.
I'm so glad. It's been really great. Jacob?
No, that's about it. I am interested. I'm interested on Matt's perspective on how not just things like the legal aspect of it, but how awareness of and tolerance of LGBT issues are going in Japan. Because it, again, from the West, just getting anime and J-pop and stuff like that over here, it seems to be moving very fast. Just that's all we get, and from that alone, it's is this a hot issue right now? Because it's just coming up way more than it ever used to. But yeah,
it is a hot issue, I think. Although I'm sort of an activist myself, so my perspective may be distorted, but I think it's a big issue. Just about everybody now actually knows the phrase LGBT. They misuse it all the time, saying oh, that person is LGBT, as an LGBT person.
I really wanted to applaud you, I guess, because as I understand from reading, there's not really government funding for advocacy groups in Japan in the same way that there is in the U.S. Or has that changed? But it's a lot of motivated individuals more.
Wait. There's government funding for advocacy groups in America?
Nonprofits and that kind of thing, yeah.
Oh, really? I didn't know that. Wow. No, yeah, there's none of that. No. But advocacy has really taken off in the last 6 years. You can really there's a one point that you can trace it to, and that was the wedding at Tokyo Disneyland of my friends Hiroko and Koyuki, who were allowed to have a wedding ceremony at Tokyo Disneyland in dresses, both of them in dresses, and it was picked up by the media like crazy. And they're both really good looking, which helps. If they had been not so good looking, it would not have been happening. And then they went on to become really serious activists. Of course, with any activism, you've got infighting about details, but it's good to see that it's gotten to that point where you've got so many different viewpoints within the advocacy, community. So it has taken off, yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thanks to all three of you for being on with me today. I'd love to talk to you again sometime, hopefully on a future podcast. I don't know what, but it's been a delight.
Really happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us on.
Yeah, and
thanks for having us.
Thank you. For you listeners out there, if you would like to hear more podcasts like this, you can always pitch us $1 on patreon.com/animefeminist. That's what pays the bills, pays our editors and contributors, and pays our editor for this podcast. You can also find more of our content at animefeminist.com, on Twitter at animefeminist, and on Facebook at animefem. And until next time, take care of yourselves out there. Bye.